You're listening to the Tank Podcast. In this episode, our editor-in-chief Masood Gosorgi speaks with Rana Foroohar, associate editor at the Financial Times, global business analyst at CNN, and the author of Don't Be Evil, a forensic study of how the world's tech giants have enriched themselves from the fruits of the surveillance economy. They talk about the ascent of platform capitalism, strategies for regulating the tech oligopolies, and what a post-FANG world might look like.
I thought maybe the first thing we could do is, because I think our readers are quite familiar with, because we've been going on about FANG and all the evils for a while, but what was your kind of
my moment
to start looking at, and between the kind of size, business practices, monopolistic activities, privacy, fake news, what was your kind of point of entry to suddenly see them in a different light?
So that's a really good question. I usually say, there were two immediate moments that really made me think I've got to write a book about this. But then there were other moments which I'd like to flesh out with you. But I'll start with the first. When I started at the FT about 3 years ago, my mandate was to write the biggest economic and business stories in commentary form. Right. And so when I do that, I like to be really focused and thoughtful about who I go after and what I follow, because sometimes journalism can be so anecdotal. Right. And it's like you want to have a kind of an intellectual construct. Right. And so I follow the money, and what I had found was that 80% of corporate value was living in just 10% of companies that had the most data and intellectual property. So it was essentially the companies that had figured out how to do surveillance capitalism, had ring-fenced all the wealth. Right. And that was interesting to me because it dovetailed with other topics that are of interest to me, like the imbalance between labor and capital, and, suddenly a lot started to make sense. That was point number one. Point number two is that I discovered that my son was a video game addict, and the way that this happened... I
listened to you on the radio, you mentioned that,
I came home and I opened a credit card bill and I thought I'd been hacked because there were all these tiny charges of $1.99. Turned out he had become addicted to FIFA Mobile, and it's one of these games that it's given to you for free. This is the business model, but then you're sold these in-app purchases. So if you want to become better, you have to buy virtual Ronaldo or whatever. So then I thought, my gosh, he's a very well-behaved child. But when I interviewed him, it was really clear that he was in kind of a cognitive fog, and he hadn't really realized that he was being pulled into this game and lost, hours and hours just in the course, and $900 of my money in the course of the month. So he and his father and I worked out a payment plan. He had to raise $300 himself with his lemonade stand, and then. And
did he charge you for the interview? Or?
Well, I told him, he's like, "Mommy, I don't want to be in your book." I said, "This is your punishment. You're in my book. This is your college money." So anyway, that was interesting. But even before that, I'd always followed the technology cycle because I've been a journalist for 30 years. And I remember going out in the mid-1990s to do a story, and at that point I was doing a story on Yahoo, not Google, because Yahoo was like the big, cool company. And at that point it seemed just a very, fun, happy-go-lucky, everybody was going to optimistic, everybody was going to change the world. But as I would follow what people were doing, it seemed to get darker, and particularly as the companies got bigger. And I remember there were a couple incidents, particularly with Google, that stuck in my mind. I was in Davos, which I always go to the World Economic Forum every year for coverage. And Google had invited 15 of us to this, special party, special meeting. It was right after they'd acquired YouTube, and I think that they were trying to convince everyone that they weren't going to eat our lunch with their which they were, of course. Yeah. But it was very secret. We got a text message, and we show up at this chalet, and it's been kitted out to look like it's in Northern California. And everybody's sitting on these sort of like ice cube looking chairs, and there's free Skittles and all that kind of, business. And we were talking about the media model, and at the end, I had this uneasy feeling because I thought, we're journalists, we're being very navel-gazing, we're just worried about our industry, but really this is about democracy and what's going to be left when we're all gone. And so I raised my hand kind of timidly, I was quite young, and I asked the question, and Larry Page, I remember him turning around and looking at me like it was the oddest thing he'd ever heard, and he said, "Oh, we have a lot of people thinking about that. Like, next question.
We will take care of it.
We will take care of it, don't worry." So that was that. the other thing was when I came back to the States after working in England, it was right around the time of the financial crisis. Media, like everything, was taking a hit. And I thought, God, I've got these 2 kids. I just gotten divorced. I'm like, I've got to make some money. Maybe I should go interview at Google. So they were looking for a few high-level PR people to follow around the C-suite folks, be almost like body men for the top-tier folks. And I went to interview for this job, and it became clearer and clearer to me that what they really wanted was for someone to walk around with their top brass and just kind of imbibe their thinking and then communicate it not to the outside world, but to the other top brass.
Right.
So it was like, to me that was, and I kept checking, like, is this really, you're just looking for me to
internal
be,
communication.
And I thought, man,
That's
if they've
so
got
weird.
this many problems,
Yeah.
they're still acting like they're a tiny company. At that point, they had 50,000 employees. They now have close to 100,000.
Yeah.
So I just thought it really was a dysfunctional culture that didn't have a sense of itself and its importance in the world.
Right. And that lack of self-awareness, do you think that was to do with the speed of the... Because one of the main things, I mean, it's a weird thing to ask maybe an FT journalist, but do you think that maybe that's endemic with the general financialization, the problem of financialization of the economy, where, whereas, airlines that are just like making money from like selling fuel and I don't know, doing futures, that kind of stuff. Is it that's the problem, or is it that?
Well, I think it is. I think it is, and in fact, I had that example in my first book of the fact that all businesses now make more money moving money around than they do selling seats or selling crisps or whatever it is. It's it is the financial.
Except pathetic us.
Except I know we're the only ones. It's no wonder Jeff Bezos decided to disrupt publishing first. We're just completely clueless about how to make money. But we love what we're doing. Yeah. So no, but I do. I think that the neoliberal economic architecture that we've all lived with for 40 or 50 years is really what this is about. And in some ways, and frankly, it's why we have the politics that we do right now. The notion that in globalization, as it's been practiced so far, capital could run so far ahead of labor.
Yes.
And companies could kind of fly 35,000 feet above national concerns. Yeah. Well, if perhaps the big banks were the poster child for that before, big tech is that times 10, because if you think capital can move across borders, just think about what data can do. Yeah. And so, to me, it's no wonder that Facebook and Elizabeth Warren are, in existential crisis. Yeah. It's about neoliberal economic thinking versus nationalism.
I mean, it's interesting you mentioned Bezos, because that was my thing about Bezos trying to impact politics, and that interaction he had with MBS and the Khashoggi case, and then on the other hand you have Mark Zuckerberg, which is sort of basically eyeing up the presidency from what we can gather. Are you really frightened, or do you think that actually politics might be a very kind of, they might get their asses kicked?
Great question. In some ways the answer to that question might come down to how far we've really come towards oligopoly in the U.S. What's the wonderful Olson quote about, it's over when the money class takes over politics. Right. And in the U.S., lobbying from big tech is massive. Google and Amazon are the number one and number two corporate lobbyists. Right. The industry itself tends to vie with big pharma and finance for the number one industry.
Right. But those two companies...
Google took more meetings with the Obama White House than any other single company. In fact, it was almost like a revolving door in and out. If you look at the top brass at Google and the top brass in the administration, and I'm a Democrat, but it's just completely inappropriate. I remember actually being on a bus once with an Indian CEO that was like, you all write about how we need to reform. You have, your 10 of your last Treasury secretaries worked at Goldman Sachs. It's like, what do you...
I gather that they're trying to replicate that in Brussels and Luxembourg. They're setting up shop in a big way.
Oh yeah, definitely. Although I think Margaret Vestager is, she is powerful, and I don't think she's taking any of their guff.
Any of their shit.
Any of their shit, But
so they're kind of going through the kind of the process of ingratiating themselves with political power. What do you think the biggest challenges to them and to their platform model is? Like,
will be
who
politically, or who are they scared? Oh, that's interesting. Who are they scared of?
Are they scared of consumers? Are they scared of
I think they're scared of Europe.
Politics, scared of Europe. Yeah.
I think they're scared of Europe. They're a little scared of China. They'd love to be in China.
Yeah.
But now that they see that China is ring fencing, and they have their own fangs, of course, they now see, okay, we need to make ourselves the national champions, so they say, at home, which frankly, I find that so cynical. That, Mark Zuckerberg, the last couple of times he's up on the Hill, there was some Reuters reporter that took a picture of his notes, and it said, if asked about China, say, we have to be the national champion for America, otherwise China will come in and, surveil you. And it's like, first of all, A, you're already surveilling us. B, you would love to be in China,
Well, you tried.
and you tried.
And Google does it anyway.
Exactly. So it's just the most cynical argument. And I think that the only thing that they're worried about are regulators. Sadly, consumers haven't yet. There hasn't been sort of an Exxon Valdez moment.
Right.
I sort of, if anything would have been that, it would have been the 2016 election.
Yeah, I saw in the crib notes you mentioned Occupy Silicon Valley. It's just very big.
It's
very difficult to occupy.
Yeah, it is very big.
Good thing
if
about
they
Wall
take
Street.
the markets down, though, that could be a turning point.
What do you mean?
Well, so one of the things that's happened, and this is a little bit of a wonky financial story, but it's important, a lot of the money that was on Wall Street post-2008 flowed into Silicon Valley, because that's when the smartphone was taking off.
Right.
So the fortunes of the big banks were declining, the fortunes of the tech companies were rising. What did they do with that money? Well, they offshored it. They put it in overseas bank accounts in the Netherlands and Ireland and the Cayman Islands. But what did they buy? It wasn't all cash. They bought corporate bonds. So
in other businesses.
So Google, Apple, these incredibly cash-rich businesses now underwrite corporate bonds the same way like a Goldman Sachs would, but they're not regulated that way.
Right.
Now, we have more corporate debt than ever before in the world. At some point, some of that is going to start going bad.
Right.
So what will the tech companies do? Will they sell this? Could that cause a market event? All this is by way of saying they are now the too big to fail institutions in our world.
What do you think the chances of deregulators? I mean, do you see any legislative, legal? Why do you think there hasn't been any challenges to the monopolistic behavior? Just it even surprised me from a not somebody who doesn't look at the markets. It's like their encroachment. So, for example, some of Amazon's worst aspects of their behavior, which you mentioned in your book and well documented elsewhere. I'm surprised there wasn't a kind of like chairman of CBI standing there going, "That's not capitalism."
Right.
Stop in your track. Why do you think that those challenges didn't come up?
So that's a very interesting question. I actually spoke to George Soros about this. I helped him think about the last two speeches at Davos that he did, which were quite good. And one of his portfolio managers who was with us told me something I hadn't thought about, which was these companies love targeted advertising. All companies. So CBI, why would CBI not? Because all their businesses are using these platforms to do targeted advertising, and it cuts their marketing budgets, and it's all part of surveillance capitalism. They, too, are starting to utilize these models. So you look, my column from yesterday in the FT, surveillance is coming into healthcare, coming into financial services. It's already in retail. Starbucks knows a heck of a lot about you. Johnson & Johnson knows a lot about you. So everyone is copying this business model.
Just going back to the Yahoo, when everything was like the sunny uplands, what was it about platform capitalism that managed to route so successfully the freeware model, things like Linux and all the other kind of initial libertarian aspirations of how did they
kind of get people to give stuff away for free?
Yes.
Essentially everything.
Instead of giving
Well, that's an interesting one. So there was this sort of ethos, which I always think has been somewhat suspect, is information should be free unless it's ours. And you could see that very early on. I actually did an interview in my book with a guy named Peter Harder, who's quite a well-known tech lobbyist in America. And he was brought into Google in 2002 by Eric Schmidt. Had an interview with Eric and the two founders. And they were interviewing him because they were already starting to think about how can we make sure that data remains free? How can we keep copyright loose? How can we think about how to shift the patent system? Because we're going to be moving into the Android phone and AI, and we need a lot of bits and bobs of intellectual property, but we don't want to have to pay a patent for them. So very early on, even before IPO, they were already starting to think of all this.
Right.
And it's fascinating. I mean, Jerome Lanier has made the point
I've interviewed
that,
him,
I mean, he's very good on this. He's like, everybody says open source, you have to have this in order to have an innovation environment. But you'll notice Apple and Google will keep the really good stuff under patent.
Yeah.
And that's still the way. And it was fascinating to me. I interviewed an entrepreneur, serial entrepreneur, and we started talking about technology, and I said, I'm writing a book about it. And he said, you should write about patents. And I said, what do you mean? And he says, well, I've just built and sold my third company, and it was a data analytics firm. And so it's become very, very difficult in the last 10 years to get patents and hold patents.
Yeah.
And
become very expensive, exponentially expensive.
And you need a lot of legal muscle, difficult to enforce. So he put the code open source. He was trying to sell it to Facebook. And they were looking at his company, another company, and they had an internal project going. They ended up going with the internal project, but he says that he has emails that prove that they took some of his code. And he was really outraged, and he went to his contact and says, what is this? And the guy said to him, you have to understand, John, we're dealing with 6 times as much information per second as a large financial institution, but we're making 1/100,000th the amount of profit on it. So if we have to pay for anything, we don't have a business model. And that's really interesting. You start to realize, gosh, these firms, if they didn't get everything for free, they actually couldn't exist.
Yeah. Never mind about the other stuff that the government paid for.
Well, exactly.
Mariana Mazzucato's
that's her
book.
big point.
Exactly.
Very, very
Absolutely.
important.
Is it possible to critique platform capitalism without critiquing capitalism itself? Is there any other potential, like, like that book, Surveillance Capitalism? I don't know if you've seen some of the reviews of it. Is the capitalism? That's a problem.
No, Shoshana is basically saying this is capitalism on steroids.
But, so a kind of a reformist critique, or is that possible? Or
I think it is possible. And in fact, it's interesting. California is kind of leading the way on this.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's the birthplace of the problems, but they're starting to think about if all value is going to live in data, and data is a raw material that comes from us, well, then data is sort of labor. Data is something we should be paid for. So the governor has proposed a digital dividend that would be given out to citizens. There might be a digital sovereign wealth fund of some kind, which is, successful in Norway and Alaska and places like that. The idea being that, all right, we like these products and services.
We need them.
Nobody's going to roll the dial back completely, but let's make sure that the pie is shared evenly. And that's very interesting to me, because I think if we got the wealth sharing right, then you could actually start to turn back some of the problems of neoliberal economics, which always favored the big, right? It was the biggest companies that could cross borders. But in the digital age, I mean, my father runs a small manufacturing business. 3D printing, he can do business anywhere. The supply chains are not so far flung anymore. So one could imagine this actually being a win-win. There's also, of course, the issue of education. Research shows that tech is always a net job creator, but only if education keeps pace. And they've got to pay up. They have to, they complain. It drives me nuts when these people complain governments need to do more, but then they're starving the tax coffers.
You don't think that, a kind of maybe a more classic solution might be just to stop all tax evasion? But do you think that won't be enough in itself because of the way they accumulate, maybe?
Well, digital could actually help with that, because if we were on a cryptocurrency, hopefully not managed by Mark Zuckerberg, but by democratically.
Then blockchain could really nail them.
Totally.
I think maybe, in England there's a thing saying, where you have nettles, what nettles are. You have duck leaves. So go to the source of the problem. The solution is normally grows adjacent
very
to
near.
the
That's
problem.
such an elegant way of thinking about it.
What do you think a post-FANG world would look like if we manage by one of these strategies, break these motherfuckers up? How do you think? What would the ecosystem? How would technology be impacted? How would politics be impacted? How would economy? We know probably. You want to have more money.
I'd love to be in a world. I mean, maybe this is very utopian, but hey, I'll make the circle of my book back to the utopian beginning. In my fantasy world, we might actually be in the sort of, Keynesian prospects for our grandchildren paradigm where maybe we don't have to work so hard. Maybe we can pursue creative things. I mean, these products have given us wonderful opportunities for creativity. Maybe we could harness some of that. Maybe we could also find a way to make it less about attention capture and more about creation. I mean, one of the things that really bothers me right now is my son in particular. I see him taking in a lot of stuff that is pre-cooked for him, but I don't see him using this to create in the world. And reading. No one's reading. I mean, we just saw some interesting new stats in the US that only a third of teenagers read for pleasure more than once a month because they're on their devices. And that's starting to affect complex thought. Professors are saying this digital native generation is coming into schools and they can't read 300 pages a week. They just don't have the capacity to do that. So I worry about our ability to solve complex problems.
Yeah. One step further, I mean, I don't want to spoil the party, but one step further is actually considering the impact of a kind of conflation of blockchain automation and application of artificial intelligence to make, never mind the FANG, the super baddie FANG. That's like the kind of like all FANGs made into one kind of a sort of moment of unity and, what's the singularity, sorry.
Well, indeed, and it's funny. I was doing a hit the other day at CNN. I was talking to the makeup artist, and she, like many people, was worried about her job being disintermediated by technology. And I said, what are you talking about? You have a high-touch job. Like, nobody's ever going to put my makeup on. No robot is going to put my makeup on. And she said, oh, no, filters. They're going to filter you.
Yeah, you don't need makeup.
And then I won't have my pension. I was just like, oh, my God. Yeah. Maybe they're going to filter us.
Cool. I think we can wrap up if that's okay. I really enjoyed it.
To hear more podcasts from Tank, you can subscribe on all major podcast platforms or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is taken from Waiting Games by Kate Simcoe and the London Electronic Orchestra.